So dear students, today I'll discuss about friction. Okay, so this is the introduction class and the very basic class about friction. Today I want to discuss about the how the frictional force arises and what is actually the meaning of this frictional force, what is the definition of this frictional force. And as I have shown here in figure, that you can see that when two body or the two surfaces you can say come into contact, here the one surface is the surface of the block and another surface is the surface of this horizontal surface. Okay, so these two surfaces are come in contact, and if we create a relative motion between these two surfaces by applying a force like this, horizontal force like this, then a opposing force F will arise, and this F will mainly arises the relative motion to oppose the relative motion. Okay, so this F will arise to oppose the relative motion between the surfaces. So here a tendency of the surface of the motion of mass m is the relative motion of this mass m with respect to this surface is forward direction. So the frictional force arises along the backward direction, because it will always oppose the relative motion of the object. Okay, and here the relative motion of the object is in forward direction, so the frictional force on the block of mass m will arise in backward direction. Okay, and in actual sense this is also a action reaction force. Okay, so if we draw the free body diagram of small m, then you can see the actual thing, that the frictional force on the block, if you can say on the block, will be in backward direction. Why it is in backward direction? Because the relative motion of the mass small m with respect to ground, this is ground, so the relative motion of this mass small m with respect to ground is in forward direction due to this force F. So if this is in forward direction, then the relative motion of the block is in forward direction with respect to the ground, so the frictional force will arise along the backward direction on the block. But if you talk about the frictional force on this surface, okay, then it will be along upward direction, along forward direction. Why it is forward direction? Because the relative motion of this surface with respect to this block is in backward direction. Okay, this is leftward direction or this is backward direction. So if the relative motion of this ground is in backward direction, so the frictional force will be in forward direction, and here the relative motion of the block is along the forward direction, so the frictional force is along the backward direction. So it is all about the relative motion. So you have to understand the relative motion of these contact surfaces, and if the relative motion of one contact surfaces with respect to other is in forward, if it is in forward direction, then the frictional force will be in backward direction, and if the relative motion of the block is in backward direction, then the frictional force will be in forward direction. So suppose I can give you another example. Okay, I can give you another example. Suppose there is a two block. This is one block and this is another block. Okay, so this will be mass of capital M, and suppose this is mass of small m. Now if we give the force here, then what will happen? Then the frictional force between these two surfaces, if we talk about the frictional force between these two surfaces, then what will happen? You can see, as soon as you will apply the force on this block, okay, then instantaneously the movement of this block, the tendency of movement of this block will be in backward direction with respect to the mass capital M. With respect to this block, the relative motion of this block will be in backward direction at the very beginning. Okay, so it will tend to move in backward direction. As it will tend to move in backward direction, so the relative motion between these surfaces, you have to look always the relative motion between these two surfaces. So if you see the relative motion of small m with respect to capital M, so what will be the relative motion initially with respect to capital M is in backward direction. So the frictional force that will act on the mass small m will be forward direction, along forward direction. But in this situation, if you talk about the frictional force of the mass capital M, then it will be in backward direction, and these are equal and opposite. So this is the action reaction force. But when we talk about the frictional force between this floor and this block, then it will similar to this. Okay, so you can say finally that the frictional force is nothing but opposing force, but it opposes always the relative motion of the object. Okay, so please keep in mind this thing. And you can define or you can analyze this frictional force, or you can understand this frictional force on another way also. That is, this frictional force is nothing but the horizontal component of the contact force. Because if you talk about the contact force, so here two contact forces arise. One force is normal reaction, this is also a contact force, and another is this frictional force F. So if you talk about contact force, here two contact forces are there. One is the frictional force and the normal reaction. But normal reaction is the vertical component and this is the horizontal component, because the net contact force will be in this direction. This will be the net contact force, and you can put it as R. Okay, instead of N you should write it as R, I think R. Okay, so we can give R as a net contact force. So what will be the net contact force? R is equal to, you can write it as root n square plus f square. Okay, so root n square plus f square. But f is the, you can say, horizontal component and n is the vertical component. Okay, so frictional force is nothing but the horizontal component of the contact force. Okay, and another thing, by nature, what type of this frictional force, in which categories this frictional force will fall? So this frictional force is nothing but electromagnetic interaction. Why it is an electromagnetic interaction? Because why, if you talk about the cause of this friction, then you can understand. Okay, so let me discuss this thing also. So from here, what does the result that I can conclude? So in these topics I can conclude two things. Okay, one is the frictional force. Frictional force always opposes the relative motion. This is very important. Opposes the relative motion of contact surfaces. And another thing is very important that I have told recently, that frictional force is a horizontal component of net contact force. Okay, and the next, what I want to know, that the cause of friction. If you know about the cause of friction, that you can understand about the what kinds of force this is. Okay, in which category this force will fall, because I have said earlier that there are some kinds of forces. That is, one is four kind of interaction. One is gravitational interaction. Another one is electromagnetic interaction, I have said earlier, and another is weak interaction, and another is what? Strong interaction. So if you talk about the frictional force, then it will fall in this category. And I have said earlier that all the forces will fall any one of this category. So when you talk about frictional force, then it will obviously fall into this category. Okay, now let me analyze why it will fall in this category. Okay, so this is very important. So for that purpose, we have to understand the cause of friction. Okay, so what is the cause of friction? Let me analyze the cause of friction. So what is the cause of friction? Okay, so you can find easily that the surfaces, the microscopic view of surface, if you talk about the microscopic view of surface, then it is no longer smooth. The surfaces will be like this. Okay, similarly, if you talk about this surface, then it will obviously like this. So you can see the cause of this friction will be due to this. Okay, so this unsmoothness of this surface. Okay, but this unsmoothness of this surface can be removed by polishing or by any other method. You can remove this unsmoothness. So after removing this unsmoothness, you can get a little bit of friction. Though if you try to smooth more and more the surfaces, still you will get some frictional force, and this is now due to the interaction between the molecules of two surfaces. Okay, so when the surface is more and more smooth, if you get the ultimate smooth of the surfaces, then what will happen? The atoms of two surfaces will come into contact, and then it will interact electromagnetically, and this electromagnetic interaction is known as adhesive force. Okay, so that's why sometimes it is called that the frictional force arises due to adhesive force. You know, there are two kind of force. Another is adhesive force, and another one is cohesive force. So cohesive force always act between the same molecules. Okay, like the molecules, if the molecules of water, you can say the molecules of water, they will give cohesive force to each other. So when same kinds of molecules always interact with this cohesive force, but different kinds of molecules always interact with this adhesive force. Okay, so this is all about the frictional force, and this is the cause of frictional force, and this is why the frictional force is called the electromagnetic interaction. Okay, thank you.